So this is going to be a different video than what I normally do. I try not to rant. I also try not to go after other content. I've been seeing a lot of really bad pirate history lately that I have no idea where it's coming from. Actually, I'm pretty sure it's coming from AI after my little experiment. But this has nothing to do with the YouTube world of piracy. Now, this is comes from 2015 and involves an actual, supposedly, at one point, respected archaeologist. In 2015, the History Channel released Pirate Treasure of the Knights Templar. The only reason I was willing to give it a chance was because Barry Clifford was the lead archaeologist on this show. Also included was Scott Walter, who, when it comes to pseudo-archaeologists, you could do worse. Kind of. So, for those who don't know, Barry Clifford is the one who discovered the Whydah. Barry Clifford has been involved in a bunch of other, I hesitate to call them archaeology missions, but to be fair, semi-archaeological missions. The first episode, entitled The Templar Connection, begins with Barry Clifford supposedly finding something. And typically if I find something of historical significance, my first choice is going to be to call, like, if I have connections with a professor or somebody who's got a lot of experience dealing with the archaeology of the area that I'm researching, that's who I'm going to contact. No, he contacts Scott Walter, apparently. Granted, a lot of this was probably hyped up for the History Channel. It was a piece of a crucifix found in Madagascar. Now, keep in mind, with all the history I've discussed on Madagascar in previous videos, if you haven't seen those, go ahead and watch them. I'll cover it briefly here. Madagascar was very active in the 17th century. Actually, Madagascar, even though it's considered to be more biologically isolated than many other places, there's animals that live in Madagascar that live nowhere else on Earth. Madagascar was not isolated when it came to people. Madagascar had active trade with the Middle East, India, China, throughout history. So when you find a Christian artifact in Madagascar, it's not really a surprise. The one in particular, this artifact in particular, immediately, just me looking at it, I come from an art history background. Looking at it, it looked very Iberian. So Portugal, Spain, that region. Which, again, with Vasco da Gama and other Portuguese explorers coming through, Portugal being involved in India, also in Mocha, seeing Portuguese features on a crucifix found in Madagascar is not out of place. Somehow, though, this one crucifix turns into Scott Walter going on a Knights Templar rant. So, in a lot of pseudo-archaeology, the biggest thing lately has been more Atlantis myths and aliens. In pseudo-history, we get folks who get obsessed with the Knights Templar and the Freemasons. We're going to get into this as we go through here. Be prepared for the usual sayings in pseudo-archaeology of looks like. If it looks like something, then it must be it. No, that's not how it works. So, instead of going to Madagascar and actually doing the research, going to libraries that had any relation with the trade in Madagascar, which, again, you guys watching the videos, you know that New York had a very strong connection with the trade in Madagascar. Instead of going looking for sources like that, Scott Whydah goes to Jerusalem. And pretty much the rest of the episode is spent with very Captain Obvious things, such as Jerusalem being holy for multiple world religions, etc., etc. The only person that makes any statement in this entire episode that I can actually get behind is the expedition historian Chris McCourt, who talks about how Madagascar is where a lot of the big pirates were, and that's true. During the era of Red Sea piracy, which I've been discussing here, and later on, after Nassau had pretty much fallen, that's where a lot of the bigger pirates went, was Madagascar's surrounding area. There's this kind of notion that I notice throughout this episode, Barry Clifford gets this whole, I'm the first person to actually look for pirates here. No. No, you weren't. The fact that they're finding anything in that area is not a surprise. I would be more shocked if they found nothing. Now, from just that one artifact and finding pieces of things on the beach, Barry Clifford makes the pronouncement that it's the Fiery Dragon, which was a ship that belonged to Billy Condon. He was active in the Caribbean, and then he was one of the pirates that moved to Madagascar during the later Golden Age. He supposedly scuttled his own ship. They find ballast stones at the site. And the whole time watching this, I'm going, where's the grid? This can be important later. When you do archaeology, you need to have a proper survey of the area. You shouldn't just be digging willy-nilly. I can understand, like, if you're mudlarking, which basically you're walking along, like, the Thames. There's a few people who do that over in London. You walk along the river, you find something, cool. Take a picture of it. Might even take it with you, depending on the laws of your area. The reason you can do that is there's constant movement there. There's no site that you're preserving. In this case, they're thinking that there are actually ships there, which you need to have a way of actually mapping the site and recognizing if, in fact, there is something there. Just looking at the images, you can tell, just looking at the video that they have, you can tell the area is heavily trafficked. There's modern construction here and there, and it's at a site we know was trafficked even in the time period. We know several ships were scuttled in that area. Somehow, though, just based on a handful of evidence, it's not really even conclusive, it's the Fiery Dragon. Somehow Scott Whydah gets a hold of connections in Jerusalem that he can go visit a Muslim shrine. And he's just walking around, people praying, while he's touching the wall and talking to the camera about the Knights Templar. No clue who he paid to be able to do that. It's awkward. Later on, Scott Whydah goes to a museum. And they have artifacts that are similar. Strange that in one of the holiest sites in Christianity, they would have such things as crucifixes. And that's whenever Scott Whydah sees that a lot of the ossuaries have skulls and crossbones on them. Now, skulls and crossbones have been used for millennia. I'd even go so far as to say there's some evidence that they appear in the Neolithic. They were used as a symbol of death. It's a very real memento mori. Remember, you will die. Right there. Well, Scott Wolter, for some reason, does not go on that thing. He instead somehow associates it with Jesus, to the Templars, and then to pirates. Somehow, the skull and crossbones represents Jesus. So, at that point, Scott Wolter leaves Jerusalem and goes to the city of Acre. And then we shift back to Barry Clifford. And somehow it comes up in this whole episode that the Knights Templar were somehow working with Chinese warrior monks, and they find Chinese porcelain, and that's somehow connected to this. I completely lost what they were going on here. Yes, there would be Chinese porcelain. That was a very common trade item in the region. This would go back before the arrival of Europeans. It would continue after. I mean, this was finding Chinese porcelain in that region at a very important trade route. That's something that you would expect to find. And then at some point, Barry Clifford finds a piece of pottery on the beach that has just has several scratches on it. And somehow that means the Freemasons were there. And then they start getting into Freemasonry. And somehow a cross symbol on a piece of pottery is not just decoration, it's not just some sort of a Christian thing. Again, it's not just decoration. Nope. It's somehow, again, referring to the Freemasons. And then we get to Acre, where Scott Wolter is investigating tunnels. And he finds X's. One of the most common forms of graffiti for all time. He finds them on the walls. And circle symbols. And somehow it's a match to the Freemason symbol that Barry Clifford had found in Madagascar. And I should add, they pronounce Madagascar so many different ways in this entire show. There's Madagascar, there's Madagascar. I don't think they ever say Madagascar once. And then somehow we got into Mary Magdalene. So during the evacuation of Acre, there were knights, some of them Knights Templar, in the tunnels of Acre. And it was like they were evacuating. And Scott Wolter somehow, this is somehow some very big revelation. And that's how we end it. And then we go to episode 2, The Great Adventure. Somehow we went from Billy Condon to Captain Kidd. Scott Wolter is now in Portugal, and it's in these scenes that we realize Scott Wolter has a very poor control of his steering. His car's like going all over the place. Not sure if he's getting wind. He was distracted. Not entirely sure, but it was kind of on a narrow road. It just was very uncomfortable looking. Somehow Christianity has connections in Portugal. I'm hoping a lot of you understand my sarcasm that Portugal and Spain, they're very Christian. Yeah. And Scott Wolter finds an ivory depiction of Christ in Portugal. And it looks so similar to the one that they had started this whole show on. I kind of put in my notes there, wow, who would have thought? See, when you're talking about art history and you're analyzing what things look like, we are one of the few disciplines of history that can say, it looks like that. Because that's what we're looking at. We're looking at features and things. There's different styles that are culturally unique. And you don't really see them too much outside of those particular cultures. In the case of Iberian art, there was a tendency toward mannerism, which had died out pretty much in Italy and most of Europe, but had remained in Spain and Portugal for a lot longer. And seeing that style, oh, that's got a very manneristic look to it. Same as if you're talking about Eastern Orthodox. You got a much earlier style of iconography, which continues to this day. You can identify this is from an Eastern church. Now, whether or not it's from Russia or Ukraine or possibly even parts of Greece, you have to analyze it further, but you can say it looks like. Well, right here's an example where you can say it looks like. It works. And we go into this long story about the history of Portugal, which is great. Portuguese history is often overlooked. And then we start getting, there's some people who believe, and then they start talking about the Knights Templars again. Portugal apparently offered sanctuary to some of them when they were fleeing France. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. We're good with this part. And then they start talking about knightly orders. And I noticed that the historian's trying to talk more. He's excited, and they just cut off what he's talking about. Meanwhile, back in Madagascar, we're back to Captain Kidd, and we're talking about the skull and crossbones. Captain Kidd, as far as we are aware, never flew the skull and crossbones. There's no reference to it being used by him. But somehow that's some of their grand evidence that it's somehow connected to the Knights Templar. And now suddenly the ship has become the Adventure Galley. And yes, the Adventure Galley was abandoned in that area. So, could some of what they've been finding be parts of the Adventure Galley? I'm okay with that. There are many other ships, though, that were scuttled there, so they find... Now, what I found very interesting, while they're talking about all these exposed ballast stones, I couldn't help but notice the old tires nearby. And somehow there's buried treasure. And for the quote, I think if there is buried treasure anywhere, it is right here. And then Barry Clifford finds a navigational divider, which is something you would expect in this area. Somehow, though, the story about Captain Kidd becomes him leaving treasure on the Adventure Galley, which he destroyed. And then we go back to Portugal, because, of course, we're not going to finish this point. We're going to scoot back to Portugal. And Scott Whydah is just, maybe the Portuguese went to Madagascar. And, yeah, I'm pretty sure they were one of the countries that's documented to have gone. That's something that should have been researched at the beginning of this entire adventure. And he finds tunnels. So, of course, Scott Whydah has to go explore tunnels. And he finds stones on the second floor, I mean, the main floor of the church, and he notices that they're kind of slanted in weird ways, so he pours water on them, and the water follows the gravity and goes into the cracks. Trying to keep a straight face explaining this, what happens here, but yeah. And that definitely means there's something underground. Never mind that's a European church, and quite a few of them have crypts and things like that underneath. Nope, this is amazing. And then, meanwhile, in Madagascar, they find a piece of... It's an angel, basically, a seraph. It's one of the cute little... To use the more common term, it's a cherub. It's a very common symbol in the Renaissance, all the way up through the 17th century, the 18th century. You can find them on greeting cards in the 19th century, the 20th century. It's very common. And somehow they now have a cult-like devotion to them, which I never knew. I know there's modern people that have some beliefs in angels and things, but never heard about it in this time period, quite to that degree. They were used on decoration on a lot of things. Finding one, you need to figure out, is it one from this time period or that time period? What country is it possibly from? What's it made out of? What could it be attached to? You don't need to go down some rabbit hole with it, because you could actually find some interesting information just using it for what it is, a piece of known decoration. And we're back in Portugal, where Scott Whydah declares that because there's this little cherub, it means there's treasure. It could also mean there is a Valentine's Day card too, but nope, it's treasure. And then he finds a church that had to have been built by the Knights Templar, which, again, I don't have an issue with that. That, chances are, it could have been. I don't know enough about some of these churches. I'd love to do a little bit more research on them, but no, I'm okay with that. That's not a problem, especially in that time period, in that region. It's great. We can live with that. And he finds more tunnels, of course, because that's what happens. Meanwhile, back in Madagascar, it's the Adventure Galley again, and Barry Clifford finds what he describes as a little cave. It's really just a hole in the rocks. Somehow he instantly jumps to the conclusion that's Captain Kidd's cabin, like on his ship. And then the cave collapses. His arm got stuck, but he returns with a spoon. Yes, he returns with a spoon. Somehow that spoon is Captain Kidd's. It's definitely his belongings. Because it's not like spoons were a very common eating utensil in the time period. Nope. I mean, in his defense, it does appear to be a 17th century spoon. It's got very distinctive shape. Great find. But it's a spoon. If you notice, this is a slightly different angle than the main part of the video. I forgot I have to phrase things a little bit differently for the powers that be. So while in Portugal, Scott Whydah discovers connections to the Angry Mustache Man people. Yes, because it's a History Channel show, we've got to have the Angry Mustache Man somewhere. And it really goes no further than just talking about the Ark of the Covenant and all the Indiana Jones things. Yep. Carry on. Then, yeah. Yep. He finds the grave slab of the first Grand Master of the Knights Templar in Portugal. And he describes the name as triggering. Apparently, the Grand Master in question, Walter Scott thinks, led an expedition. I mean, the Portuguese leading expeditions of discovery. Really not out of place. And somehow all of these different sailors had to be sailing under this organization that Scott Whydah calls the Order of Christ. Yes, I will tell you, a lot of well-connected people in this time period were connected to knightly orders. Some of them were religious, some of them were political. Yes, it was a normal thing. It was not some grand conspiracy. No, it was a normal thing. It was your club. And yes, you would want to help your club. So, do I feel that this is some grand realization? No. And honestly, I feel like he spent way too much time in Portugal at this point. And that is the moment where Barry Clifford finds a rock or something, which somehow could be Templar. And that brings us to episode 3, The Case of Captain Kidd. So, the whole argument on this is the big rock-looking thing is too smooth to be lead, and it makes a different sound than lead, apparently. So immediately their assumption is it's 100% silver. The weight's going to fluctuate throughout this entire episode. It starts at 100 pounds. So keep notes as I go through. Might even make a drinking game out of it if you want to. So they start talking about Captain Kidd's history, which I'm not really going to get into. I'm pretty sure most of you who are on this channel already know his history. I'll be covering it on one of the later videos, but yeah, in 1701 he was executed. Kidd kind of got done dirty by both his crew and his backers. Was he a pirate? Yes. Was he a willing pirate? That's where the gray area is. Most of the ships he attacked did have papers that technically made him taking them legal. But immediately they start talking about buried treasure. Then they start talking about how he lived in Manhattan, which, it's true, he did. And they find these markings, on this, we're going to call it a block of metal. Those of you who know, you already know what it is. Spoilers, it's not silver. They find markings on it, and for some reason they completely ignore that there's an S next to the T, and the T somehow becomes a triple tau, which is a Masonic symbol. It also represents the Holy Trinity. It's used in Christianity, but no, it's definitely the Freemasons. So Scott Walter goes to New York, where he talks to Dr. Mark Rivera, who's a Freemason. And at that moment, the bar of metal becomes 110 pounds. Gain 10 pounds somehow. And Scott Walter's showing off the symbols. And yes, every Archmason would recognize that symbol. And of course, it has a connection to the Templars. I put in my notes here, why are they skipping the S? To this day, I have no clue why they weren't looking at the whole thing and just looking at that one piece. Freemasons actually started out as a guild. They were literally the Guild of Masons. Now, as guilds started to disappear, and we started having, like, modern labor as we think of it, some of these clubs, which they essentially were clubs. They were professional clubs. They did have ceremony, they had different levels and things. Some of them did convert over to being what we call today secret societies. A little note on the Masons, although some of their rituals tend to be a little secretive, if you want to know about Freemasons, just ask one. Literally, it's not that hard. Chances are you probably know a Freemason. I know several, and they are very friendly people. If you want to know something, they'll talk to you about it. There's no great mystery with them. They have their ceremonial sort of mysteries. Same way, if any of you have been in a fraternity in college, the same sort of thing. Maybe a little bit more professional. I don't think paddles are involved. So, at this moment, we go back to Barry Clifford, who's all excited about his big block of metal that is now 200 pounds. It shot up 90 pounds since the last measurement. And he starts talking about how Madagascar is a dangerous place, and there's pirates from Mogadishu, and leaving it there, they have to be careful. They have to make sure nobody finds out about it. So the first thing they do is they call Scott Walter. So Scott Walter's immediate question in New York is, why did Kidd live in southern Manhattan? I mean, the obvious answer for those of us who are aware of the area and the history of it, that's where the harbor was. That's where the settlement was. Yes, there were some, they were starting to branch out with other settlements. I mean, they'd been doing it since the Dutch were in charge. But that was where, if you If you were somebody especially involved with shipping, that's where you'd want to be. They find his name in the Trinity Church records. Apparently, Kidd actually had left the church, borrow block and tackle to help build it. I mean, it's not... For somebody that was a privateer, this would not be out of the question. He's trying to have a sense of legitimacy. His name appears with the church, with the pews, and this is being treated like some great discovery. This is stuff that most of us who've studied this time period, we've known about. Maybe the History Channel doesn't necessarily know about it, but this is more of, this is cool, as opposed to, this means something. No, it doesn't mean that much. Scott, calm down. And meanwhile, back in Madagascar, it's now 100 pounds. It lost weight. At this point, Barry and the team decide to study a cemetery. I'm going to be completely honest, this was actually about the moment that I lost a lot of respect for Barry Clifford. They go to what is called the Pirate Graveyard. It's called that because they found graves with skulls and crossbones on them, which was a normal memento mori in the time period and after, and just started saying that that's where the pirates were buried. It wasn't. More than likely, a lot of pirates would have been buried in unmarked graves, and they might have been marked at the time period, but time the way it is, and that area the way it was, yeah, very unlikely that many of them have survived to present. And they treat it like they discovered it, and the cut grass should be the dead giveaway that they didn't actually discover it. Usually, if you find an archaeological site, the grass is not already cut for you. And of course, they start finding different symbols, which most of us would look at, oh, it's a symbol in the cemetery. Immediately becomes Freemasons. And back in New York, Scott Walter decides to explore the Trinity Church Cemetery. They don't actually say which one it is, as there's actually 3, but it's colonial era. And of course, Scott Walter finds graves with skull and crossbones on them in a colonial cemetery. And being in New York City, he also finds Masonic symbols, and this is just incredible. If any of you have explored cemeteries in New York City, you can understand the sarcasm in my voice. Freemasonry was practiced very openly. Many of our founding fathers in the United States, they were Freemasons. The fact that there's Masonic symbolism in Washington, D.C., and New York, and on our money, it's not a coded message. It's literally, I thought this symbol was cool, so we're going to use it. Normally, when there's like a secret conspiracy, they don't usually put coded messages out for everybody to see. So this cemetery that he's treating as basically as contemporary to Kidd's, actually about 30 years after Kidd had already been executed. And then we've got Barry Clifford again finding random symbols and saying that they're like important clues. Keep in mind, like, again, this site has been disrupted for hundreds of years. But these random finds that literally are just laying on the beach, these are clues to something. And that's when Scott discovers that Kidd did not fund himself. He was a privateer. Like, we need to... I'm going to say this. Scott, though, describes what he calls a cabal. That word has very strong weight. It was not a secret society. It was wealthy New York merchants investing. And Scott ends up finding a reproduction of a diary from the time period and treats it as though this is new information. I need to repeat, it's a reproduction of a diary from the time period. There's an entry from October 3rd that talks about Kidd, 2, and Every, how Bellamont was trying to stop piracy, and somehow Kidd becomes a Mason. The Mason that Scott Walter decides to talk to, the Mark Rivera, he responds with, "That's possible, but unlikely." And Scott Walter left the door open, and then he talks about how Kidd was connected. And the whole time, as somebody who has actually studied this time period, who presented about numerous times, my only response is, no duh. And then, back in Madagascar, we have Barry Clifford finding what he thinks are cannonballs corroded together. And then he thinks he finds more. Again, Madagascar was a trading hub. Most of your ships operating at all during this time period had cannon. Later on, they were actually, you had to have at least something for insurance purposes. So you might not have had a 6-pounder, but you might have a swivel gun. And that would be what you needed for insurance purposes. Really should do a video on insurance in this time period. It's quite interesting. But now we get to episode 4, The Forgotten Fortress. Apparently, word spread to the government that they found this magnificent treasure. And the government wants to inspect the site, and strangely enough, the grids that I mentioned at the very beginning that were missing, they suddenly started having grids appear. I'm going to say this can become important again later. So, Scott Walter is now considered a historian at this moment. So, Scott Walter, just a little background on him, he got a business degree, and then he went into engineering and, believe, materials as his other bachelors. Yes, I do feel that if you do not have a degree in history, you can be a historian, but that requires you to actually know how to analyze history, which Scott Walter's really not doing a good job of that. We get to Scott Walter in Boston. He visits to Boston's public library, where he starts reading the letters between Kidd and Bellamont. I mean, these are things that anybody studying Kidd, you're going to encounter these. Kidd was changing stories. Bellamont was basically trying to get Kidd arrested. He referred to Kidd as a liar and a thief. At some point during this entire, during his entire visit to the library, somehow Scott Walter jumps from Kidd's trial, which actually happened, to lost Portuguese Templar treasure. And that is where Scott decides that he's going to go to Mount Hope Bay to look at a rock. Dighton Rock. And of course, we have this some people, I feel, if you're watching a show that you're a little concerned may or may not be factual, the amount of times that you see looks like, well, here looks like, and some people, and mainstream, and things like that, take a drink. And if you are pretty sloshed by the end of it, yeah, you're not going to remember anything of value anyway, so you're good to go there, I guess. What this is, I don't understand how this is somehow connected to Captain Kidd. Meanwhile, back in Madagascar, Barry's thinking there are 2 wrecks. Got news for Barry. If going off the documentation, there's probably a lot more than 2 wrecks, but give him the benefit of the doubt here. Moving back to Scott Walter, we're Scott's seeing a face and a body in this rock, and somehow this is proof that Templars were in America. And it's that point that he goes to the East Hampton Library in Long Island, where he finds a cloth that's made with gold thread that had been given to Mary Gardner, who was one of the people who helped Kidd hide some of the treasure. We know about this. This is documented. It was silk and gold from India. And Scott's like, oh, this is very interesting. It is. I'd love to see it because it's something that there's enough provenance that, yeah, it's more than likely from Kidd. The style fits with India. It's from the time period. It works. I'm okay with this piece of fabric. I'm okay with Scott calling it interesting. It is. It's actually cool. And somehow Scott Walter hops over to Portugal, and that somehow it's connected to Madagascar, and the poor librarian. I really would love to buy her coffee or something. She just looked absolutely petrified at this. She's just looking at him, and her only response is, wow. And at that point, Scott Walter starts mansplaining how a globe works. I wish I could get a clip to put there. You can definitely find the episode. It just makes you very uncomfortable watching it. So, for the first time in this entire series, Barry Clifford starts using technology. Sonar. Keep in mind, this is a very busy port. It's been a very busy port for a long time. Now, granted, it's not big ships now, it's small boats, but it's still, there's a lot of things. And the sonar keeps hitting rocks. And now we are back with Scott again. It hops back, where he's again a historian. And he starts thinking that maybe the Portuguese set up a fort on Madagascar. We know a lot of these trading posts were set up as forts. This is not some new information. This is just how the Europeans set up their factories in general. And Scott Walter's like, the reason they did this was they had something valuable. They had to have a building to put it in. Somehow we've gotten away from the rock, somehow we've gotten away from everything, and Scott decides that he's going to try to find this building. And the biggest point that he has to make is you need mortar for a building. I mean, never mind that you can use loose rock if you want to build something quickly. Never mind that you could use wood. There's trees on Madagascar. Nope, you need mortar for it, according to him. So he's going to go look for limestone, because that's the only way to get that. And Barry finds a wreck that's supposedly under what he thinks is the Fiery Dragon. Yes, we're back to it being the Fiery Dragon. And he finds a hollow chamber that has to be the cargo hold. I mean, you got to keep in mind, the cargo hold would have been made out of wood. Madagascar is not exactly known for amazing preservation of artifacts, so the chance of there actually being a cargo hold intact is extremely slim. If we're talking about maybe the Baltic Sea, yeah, I can totally see a cargo hold being intact. Not shallow water in Madagascar. And it's at this moment where Scott Walter, who's now in Madagascar, discovers a building that's been completely forgotten. Although, for some reason, while it was forgotten, somebody did remember to mow. Half the time my apartment complex can't remember to mow, but they remember to mow around this forgotten building. And then Scott Wolter proceeds to say that the Malagasy couldn't build something like this. Never mind that the Malagasy, technically speaking, are very multicultural. From their ancestors come from many different places and many different building techniques. Like, there's literally no reason why they couldn't have built it. And he talks about how it's a defensive structure with fairly large windows at the ground level, because that is definitely how you defend buildings in this time period, or with large windows on the ground level. Episode 5, The Flaming Cross. Scott Wolter finds caves in Madagascar. And he starts exploring them, and he's so happy he finds limestone, and of course he has to go into the cave. There's literally no reason to go into the cave, but he has to. So they leave us in suspense there, and Barry Clifford, he finds an ivory tusk on an island off the coast of Africa that had trade with India. And he is extremely excited, which, I mean, yeah, that'd be cool to find. That'd be cool to find pre-ban ivory. Amazing. It's just not... This is, again, an artifact that you would expect to find. Some point, we're back with Scott Wolter, who starts talking about the local legends. And he's so excited that there's limestone in the cave. And then we find out there's a crab in the cave. Not even like some giant crab, just little crab. And that's... He gets out of the cave there eventually. The metal ingot now is 100 pounds, by the way. And Scott and Barry finally meet for the second time in this whole series. Chris McCourt, I really don't want to badmouth the guy. He actually seems like one of the few people in this entire show that is fully aware of logic. Scott goes off on his ramblings about the Masons and the Knights Templar, and Chris's response is, "Your point is well taken." And that's when they made the amazing revelation that Kidd silver came from India. And that the Portuguese had settled in Goa, which, I mean, any of you watching this series, you already know the Portuguese were involved in India. And Barry Clifford's like, says to Scott Wolter, "You need to get to India." Unsure what exactly getting to India is going to solve, but at this moment, I'm starting to think that everybody's just getting a little weirded out by Scott Wolter. In this same little clip that Chris McCourt finds a porcelain cup that's fairly intact. And once again, we don't see grids. And then at some point they find, looks like a monk's head. It's part of a sculpture. And they call their expert in London, which I'm really curious who this expert is. And suddenly we have Scott in Goa. Because of course another country just needs to have Scott Wolter walking around saying everything was made by the Masons and the Knights Templar. And wouldn't you believe it, he goes to a monastery and finds skull and crossbones and crosses on the pavement. He's very happy. I mean, he's celebrating. And the whole time I'm watching this, at this moment I think this is when my wife walked in. and she sees the look on my face, which is very similar to look right here, just going over this. I think I was yelling at the television at that moment, trying to figure out why he thinks it's strange that there are Christian symbols at a monastery, at a Christian monastery. Well, be happy to know at this moment the metal ingot has remained 100 pounds. And they start talking about about some of the ships that went missing, some of the Portuguese ships. They talk about the wars between the Portuguese and the Marathas, and I should have mentioned the Mughals as well, as there was quite a bit of conflict there at that point too. At this moment, they start talking about Olivier Levasseur. Those of you who are familiar with his activities in the Caribbean, well, after the Caribbean became pretty unsafe for pirates, he was one of the pirates who went to Madagascar. He was very successful. I'm not even going to use the numbers that they use here, but apparently one of the things that he stole was the Flaming Cross of Goa. It was 300 pounds of solid gold. Levasseur ended up being captured by the French, even though he was trying to be legal at that moment. No, he ended up getting captured. He was executed for piracy, and he allegedly had some piece of paper that had a code to find his treasure that supposedly he buried. Given that Madagascar was a trading post even at that point in time, could he have spent everything? Very likely. I mean, he might have hid some of it. It's one of the few times that I'm not too bothered by there being a buried treasure story, because he wasn't planning on getting captured, so it's a pretty good chance he tried to put some of his wealth away. And he was very successful. Oh, at this point, Scott Wolter is now an explorer. He's no longer a historian, he's an explorer. And Barry Clifford wants to dig on what's called Pirate Island. And that's where we begin the last episode. I'm so happy. So happy. It's called Treasure Island. So, we start with Scott Wolter in Goa. And he's just going on and on and on about how that's Portuguese Templars. I mean, never mind that the Templars were a Christian order of knights, and he's in a church, so a Catholic church, so of course there's a lot of symbols that are to be in common. Nope. So we go back to Barry Clifford, who is on what's called Pirate Island. And they bring in some Spanish geologists to help look for disturbances in the soil of an island that for the last almost 300 years has been rumored to have pirate treasure. They're looking for disturbances in the soil. It's a mysterious island in the middle of a harbor. Meanwhile, back in India, I wish I was kidding. I should have said at the beginning, but most of these episodes, the first 15 minutes are a recap from the episode before, and then the rest is them just hopping back and forth, making everything seem like this amazing discovery, when it's usually Scott Wolter finding something that's already known, or making up something, and Barry Clifford just finding junk on the beach. So Scott finds a person that today in India carves religious figures. Keep in mind, a lot of what they're finding, the monks, the crucifix, all this stuff, these are very standard Catholic images. When you talk about, like, the Portuguese and the Spanish, there's a lot of styles that it's culturally the norm. And in the case of being near a Portuguese cathedral in India, what style do you think a lot of the folks are going to emulate? They're going to emulate what they know, which is the Portuguese style. So meanwhile, back in Madagascar, they've actually brought the grids back. They're doing actual archaeology again, and that's when McCourt finds a key. And Barry Clifford is so excited because it's a pirate treasure chest key. The only one. And meanwhile on the island they dig a hole and, surprise, they find nothing. In India, Scott finds Christian artifacts in a museum. And he finds an ivory carving of Jesus. Keep in mind, this is Portuguese mainly. And he finds a smaller version of the same sort of iconography that Barry Clifford had supposedly found at the very beginning of this entire show. You're not going to even realize like just how amazing this is. After how many thousands of miles of travel, Scott Wolter cannot believe that it's a 17th century Portuguese depiction of Jesus. And suddenly he's like, I was right all along. And it's like, I thought that had something to do with Jerusalem and, like, maybe 12th century? No, nope, he's right about it. And somehow Goa is connected to the Indian Ocean pirates. Yeah. Somehow, India, in general, is connected to the pirates that were operating at the time in the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. I mean, this is before my series here on YouTube. I'm trying to rationalize why this is considered to be this amazing revelation. Well, Barry at this point hands over the big chunk of metal. And there's a little bit of like, I mean, this is the last season, I mean, the last episode. This is the only season of this series, and I'll get into why. They start talking about how the pirates rob ships and around Madagascar. And they're still obsessed with the T, and they're ignoring the S next to the T. And then they start talking about Lebus's cryptogram. And somehow it's related to the Templars and the Freemasons and the Masonic code and society is somehow the pirates' code. Never mind that every pirate crew had their own articles and that there was actually no pirates' code that was universal. And that's how it ends. And that is how this travesty of history ends. And there is no second season because UNESCO shut it down. Remember what I said about there not being proper grids and not proper surveying of the site? Yeah, UNESCO felt the same way. My big takeaway from this entire series is no matter how well established a figure can be when it comes to history, in this case we're talking about Barry Clifford, they are not exempt from being wrong. The problem is when you're at that level of being wrong and throwing in pseudo-history and pseudo-archaeology and not using proper archaeological protocols, you tend to cast doubt on your prior work, which my big complaint with the Whydah Museum is they don't properly publish a lot of their finds. So, yeah, you might see an exhibit, you might see like some really grainy pictures, but it's really hard to get like some of the documentation like you can get from like the Williamsburg collection or the Royal Armories, the Victoria and Albert Museum. Like so many of these museums where you can see their collections, you can read like when was it found. Sometimes they'll give context for it, they'll describe what it's made out of. The Whydah Museum does not do that. And further, what always has aggravated me with the Whydah Museum is their artwork that they had commissioned for the museum does not actually represent any of their research. It's all what we'd class as fantasy pirates. I do not doubt that Barry Clifford found the Whydah. The Whydah was known to have went down in that region. It was not so much he discovered it, he rediscovered it. A lot of folks didn't think there was actually anything much left from it. So, yeah, good on him. He found it. There is stuff left. The problem is the methodology gets called into question. I was talking to another pirate historian, actually, about the silk sling on the pistol. If you look at the pictures that the Whydah Museum has released, it's just laying on top of the pistol. It's not wrapped. There's no evidence on how it was actually attached. This is the context that's missing. We don't know how that silk sling was attached. We don't even know if it... What if they just found it laying on top of it? You can't assume that it was used as a sling. Captain Johnson, there's some holes in the general history of pirates. We know that. There's other things where it's like, oh, he's very detailed. We don't know if this is a fiction or if this is real. And not having proper documentation raises questions. Never assume that you know everything related to whatever topic you study. You might have like your focus, and that's like your special interest. It's all that you care about. With Scott Walter, it seems to be the Knights Templar and Freemasons, and it tends to make him completely ignore obvious routes of research. Which, again, going back to the first episode, if I had been shown that artifact, told where it was found, I would have immediately started investigating Portuguese and Spanish sources. Figuring out, okay, could this be part of a shipwreck? Yeah. Remember all that porcelain I mentioned? That's what UNESCO thinks might be the key. They think it actually might have been a Chinese ship that went down, not a European pirate ship. Are they right? Given that region, I'd hate to say it, it's impossible to tell. Unless somebody finds a conclusive remain, such as a ship's bell, something like that, that's named, there is no way to be sure. And even then, given how many wrecks would be in that area, even then, how do you know that wreck that you think the bell came from isn't actually the wreck next to it? So, hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, like, subscribe, comment. I normally don't do rant videos, but I've been seeing way too much bad pirate history. I just wanted to get this out of my system. So, take care. Have an awesome day.